It's every parent's worst nightmare. For students, full of promise, brutally murdered in the comfort of their own home. A quiet town shattered by an act of unimaginable violence. Moscow, Idaho, a place where the streets are usually safe, where neighbors know each other by name, became the scene of a chilling crime no one could have seen coming. And the killer? He was closer than anyone could have ever imagined. November 13, 2022. For lives ended in the dead of night, in a house that felt like any other college home. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. The friends, living together, working together, laughing together. One moment, they were out enjoying their evening. The next, they were gone. Stabbed to death in the heart of their sanctuary, in a way so brutal that even seasoned investigators were left reeling. And the most chilling part? The killer was so close, so familiar, no one had any idea. Not the friends, not the police, no one. They were living their lives, walking through their days, oblivious to the monster hiding in plain sight. What happened that night? Why were these students targeted? And how did someone so seemingly ordinary blend in among them, moving so undetected, that even the community was left in shock? In this chilling story, we will piece together the events that led to this unspeakable tragedy. And explore the question everyone has been asking: who could have committed such a heinous act, and why? Moscow, Idaho. A place where time seems to slow down, where life is simple, and neighbors greet each other with a smile. It's the kind of town that feels safe, a place where families raise their children, and students settle in to pursue their dreams. For most, it's a peaceful sanctuary, a home away from home. But on November 13, 2022, Moscow would lose its innocence. And everything would change in the blink of an eye. It was supposed to be like any other night for 4 University of Idaho students. Just 4 friends, living out their college years in a shared house just a few blocks from campus. A house that was home, familiar, comfortable, and filled with laughter. The kind of house where you drop your keys and kick off your shoes, relaxed and safe from the world outside. Kaylee and Madison, roommates and best friends, shared a bond that had only grown stronger over the years. Their laughter was the backdrop of their shared home, and the two were often inseparable. Xana, a bright and ambitious young woman, was equally close to her roommates. Ethan, a standout athlete, had been dating Xana for a little over a year. The group was living what seemed like a normal college life, a life that would be shattered by events that no one could have predicted. But on that night, as darkness fell over the small town, something unimaginable was about to unfold. The house, usually filled with the noise of late-night studying and friendly conversation, would soon become a crime scene, a place where 4 young lives would be extinguished in the dead of night. By the time the morning light broke, everything would be different. And in the hours that followed, questions would start to swirl. Who did this? And why? As the clock ticked, Moscow's reputation as a peaceful, safe town would be shaken to its core. Around noon on November 13th, a call to 911 set the wheels in motion, a call that would soon shatter the lives of those closest to the victims. It wasn't from the victims themselves, though. It was from a friend of theirs, someone who had grown concerned after being unable to reach them. The friend had arrived at the house and noticed something wasn't right. A feeling of unease took hold, prompting them to call for help. As authorities rushed to the scene, the clock was ticking. For Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, the call he would later receive from the police would mark the beginning of a nightmare he could never have prepared for. "I knew something was wrong," he would later recall, as the news began to sink in. Kaylee, his daughter, had been involved. And no one knew the extent of what had happened yet, no one could fathom what they were about to uncover. When law enforcement arrived, the house looked just like any other student rental on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Neighbors had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. But as officers approached the home, something felt off. No one expected that they would be stepping into a scene that would go down as one of the most disturbing in the history of Idaho. The door was unlocked, and the officers made their way inside, unaware of the nightmare awaiting them. At first glance, the house appeared to be untouched. But as they ventured deeper into the rooms, the horror became undeniable. The chaos was everywhere. The violence, beyond comprehension. The 4 students, all victims of a brutal attack, lay scattered throughout the house, each with stab wounds so severe that it took seasoned investigators by surprise. The initial confusion was palpable. How had this happened? How could such an act of violence occur in a town so small, so peaceful? Moscow, Idaho, had never seen anything like this before. No one could understand how the killer had struck so violently, and yet managed to slip away without leaving any obvious trace behind. And as the investigators processed what they were seeing, one question lingered in the air: how could a murderer have been so close to the victims, and no one suspected a thing? But when investigators entered that house, what they found would leave them reeling. As the investigation unfolded, it became painfully clear that this was no ordinary crime. Law enforcement, forensic teams, and investigators began the meticulous task of processing the scene. The house, now a crime scene, was swarming with officers and investigators. Flashing lights cast an eerie glow against the cold night, and outside, the hum of police radios filled the air. Inside, a far more chilling story was unfolding. The victims had been found on the 2nd and 3rd floors of the house. Kaylee and Madison were on the 2nd floor, Xana and Ethan on the 3rd. The violence was brutal and relentless. Each victim had been stabbed multiple times, with no signs of a struggle. The crime had been swift, and with each new discovery, the mystery deepened. What could have motivated such a horrific act? And how did the killer know exactly where to strike? One of the most perplexing details that emerged during the early stages of the investigation was the lack of forced entry. There were no signs of broken windows, no forced doors, nothing to suggest that the perpetrator had to break in. The police began to wonder, could the killer have been someone the victims knew? A friend? A classmate? The idea that this might have been a targeted attack slowly began to take shape, but the question lingered: why them? As investigators combed through the house, every detail was scrutinized. The layout of the rooms, the placement of the bodies, the absence of defensive wounds, each new discovery raised more questions than answers. The sense of disbelief among the officers was palpable. How could this happen in a town like Moscow, where crime was virtually unheard of? One thing was clear: this wasn't just a random act of violence. Whoever was responsible had a specific purpose, a reason for targeting these 4 young people. But what was that reason? Why had they been chosen? And how could someone blend in so well with a community that prided itself on being close-knit and safe? The investigation was just beginning, but it was already clear that the answers would not come easily. And with every new twist, the case seemed to grow more complex. The small-town peace of Moscow had been shattered, and the residents were left grappling with a nightmare they never could have imagined. As the investigation continued, the tension began to mount. Police combed through every inch of the house, every clue, every lead, hoping for something that could bring them closer to the truth. But the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the case became. The lack of clear motive and the strange silence surrounding the crime only made things more perplexing. Detectives quickly realized that this wasn't a typical murder investigation. There were no clear suspects, no obvious signs of robbery or personal vendettas. The victims were college students, young, vibrant, with no apparent enemies. Each of them had their own circles of friends, but nothing stood out as a reason for anyone to want them dead. It was as if they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the days passed, public speculation grew. The town, once known for its quiet serenity, was now in a state of unease. Rumors ran rampant. Who could have done this? Was it a random stranger? A jealous ex? Or, perhaps, someone closer to them than anyone could have imagined? Theories ranged from a botched robbery to a targeted attack, and with every passing hour, the investigation seemed to hit one dead end after another. The initial suspects came and went. First, a man who was seen acting suspiciously in the area on the night of the murders. His alibi was checked and ruled out. Then, there were whispers about a possible connection to a former boyfriend or a classmate who had been overly possessive. But none of these theories seemed to stick. Each lead fell apart as quickly as it had emerged. As the investigators worked tirelessly, the frustration was mounting. The case had drawn national attention, and pressure was building from every direction. With no clear suspect, no breakthrough in sight, the community began to lose hope that the killer would ever be caught. The days dragged on with little progress, each new clue offering only more questions and dead ends. Then, just as the investigation seemed to be reaching a standstill, a tip came in, one that would send the case in an entirely new direction. The tip came from a source who had seen something unusual, someone who had noticed a car parked near the victim's house in the early morning hours of November 13th. The witness couldn't remember many details, but what they did remember was key, a white sedan, parked in the dark, far too close to the house. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it was enough to spark the next phase of the investigation. Weeks into the investigation, with the pressure mounting and no clear leads in sight, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough, one that would send shockwaves through the case and the entire nation. The person who would eventually be arrested was someone no one had suspected, someone who blended into the background, almost unnoticed. Bryan Kohberger. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old graduate student at Washington State University, had been living in the small town of Pullman, just a short drive from Moscow. A quiet man, Kohberger had enrolled in the university's criminal justice program, a field that seemed to make him an unlikely suspect in such a brutal crime. But his background, his studies, and even his personal habits would soon be linked to the crime in ways no one could have imagined. It wasn't until investigators began piecing together the details of Kohberger's life, through DNA evidence, cell phone data, and surveillance footage, that a chilling connection began to form. It turned out that Kohberger had been near the scene of the crime on multiple occasions. His cell phone records placed him in the area around the time of the murders. Then, there was the DNA, the crucial break that would ultimately tie him to the crime. Evidence collected from the crime scene matched his DNA profile. But there was more. The investigators learned that Kohberger had been driving a white Hyundai Elantra, a car that had been seen near the house where the murders took place. It was a small detail, but in a case as complex as this one, it would turn out to be the missing piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, Kohberger, once just a student in a small town, became the prime suspect in one of the most high-profile cases in recent history. What was even more shocking was the revelation of Kohberger's odd behavior. He had been seen in public acting strangely, even speaking about the case in ways that didn't sit right with those around him. He had reached out to law enforcement in a bizarre attempt to offer his help in solving the very crime he would later be charged with. This, combined with his background in criminal justice, made it even harder to fathom, how had this quiet, seemingly normal student become a killer? Just days before the arrest, Kohberger's name had barely come up in the investigation. But now, everything was falling into place. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the world. The calm, peaceful town of Moscow, which had once been a place where nothing ever happened, was now the center of a case that would capture the attention of millions. But the arrest was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into Kohberger's life, they uncovered even more unsettling details. Details that would make the truth behind the murders even darker than anyone could have anticipated. As the investigation moved forward and more details about Bryan Kohberger's life emerged, public theories began to flood in. Speculation ran rampant. Everyone had their own idea of what had driven him to commit such a horrifying act. Some believed it was a random attack, a senseless act of violence that just happened to involve 4 students. Others, however, speculated that the attack was deeply personal. Was Kohberger obsessed with his victims? Or was there something darker, something more deeply rooted in his past, that pushed him to take such drastic and brutal action? Theories about Kohberger's motivations spread quickly, especially when his background began to come under intense scrutiny. As a criminal justice student, Kohberger had been known to talk about crime and criminal behavior, sometimes in ways that seemed unnerving. Experts began to weigh in, discussing the possibility that Kohberger may have been obsessed with the concept of the perfect crime or driven by a need for control. Could it have been a desire for power, or even a twisted fascination with the criminal justice system itself? His studies and the language he used in conversations with peers and faculty only seemed to deepen the mystery. Some experts suggested that Kohberger may have been dealing with deep-seated psychological issues, obsessions that led him to act impulsively, or perhaps a sense of superiority that allowed him to justify the murders in his own mind. In his social media posts and messages, Kohberger sometimes seemed to express frustration with his own life and with others, particularly women. Did this frustration manifest in a violent way toward these 4 students, who, in some ways, represented everything he couldn't have? Or was it a more calculated decision, something he had planned for weeks, even months? The chilling nature of the crime added to the confusion. On one hand, it appeared to be an incredibly deliberate act. The victims had been stalked, the crime seemed meticulously planned. But on the other hand, the violence was so random, so extreme, that it seemed to defy any rational explanation. Was Kohberger someone who snapped in a moment of rage, or was this something he had been building up to for a long time? With each new theory, the question of why remained unanswered. Was it revenge? Obsession? A thirst for infamy? Or, perhaps, something more personal, something no one could have predicted? But as investigators dug deeper into Kohberger's past, one question kept lingering: what, exactly, drove him to commit such a brutal act? As the case continues to unfold, Bryan Kohberger now faces the long and arduous process of trial. The spotlight on him has only grown brighter, with cameras following every move, journalists tracking every piece of evidence. What was once a quiet college town is now at the center of national attention. As Kohberger stands accused of murdering 4 innocent students, the big question remains: will justice be served, or is there more to this story than we realize? The charges against Kohberger are as chilling as the crime itself. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each of the victims. He is also facing burglary charges, as authorities believe he entered the house with the intent to kill. His legal team has entered a plea of not guilty, and as the trial progresses, Kohberger's defense strategies are becoming clearer. His attorneys have raised the possibility of a mental health defense, suggesting that his actions may have been the result of psychological issues or even a possible psychiatric disorder. While this may be a tactic to reduce his sentence or avoid the death penalty, it has raised new questions about his state of mind and what motivated him to commit such horrific acts. As the trial begins to take shape, investigators are continuing to present new evidence. DNA and forensic details that tied Kohberger to the crime scene are being scrutinized, and the prosecution is building a case that highlights the premeditated nature of the murders. Witnesses, experts, and law enforcement officials have all testified, each piece of testimony pushing the case closer to its resolution. But there are still gaps in the story. Kohberger's motives, his exact involvement, and the details of how the killings unfolded are still under investigation. The public's reaction has been intense, with many closely following the trial, eager to see how this high-profile case will unfold. Families of the victims, still struggling with their grief, are looking for closure, while the rest of the world watches with bated breath, waiting for answers to the questions that have haunted them since that fateful night in November 2022. The outcome of this trial could set a significant precedent in how we view violent crimes, especially those as chilling and brutal as this one. As the case continues, the question remains, will the truth come to light, and will Kohberger face the full consequences of his actions? Or will the complexity of this case leave us with more questions than answers? Only time will tell. The tragic deaths of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin have left an indelible mark on the small town of Moscow, Idaho, and on all of us who followed this case from the moment the news broke. For promising lives, full of potential and hope, were brutally cut short. As the investigation has unraveled, the search for justice has become a journey not only for their families and loved ones, but for the entire nation. While the trial of Bryan Kohberger continues, one thing is painfully clear: no town, no community, no group of friends, is immune to the horrors of murder. Moscow, once known for its quiet streets and peaceful atmosphere, will never be the same. The chilling reality that something this horrifying could happen just blocks from a college campus has made us all reflect on the safety and trust we place in those around us. In the end, we're left with one haunting question: how well do we really know the people in our lives? What lies beneath the surface of the people we interact with every day? The search for answers is never simple, and in this case, it has only led to more questions. But one thing is certain: this case, this tragedy, will not be forgotten. And as the trial continues and the legal process unfolds, justice for Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan remains at the forefront of everyone's minds. As we await the final chapters of this story, we're reminded that the search for truth, no matter how painful, is a relentless pursuit. One that must continue until the full story is told. If you want to stay updated on this case and others like it, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.